Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some stenciled and embossed background cards using the new Spiral Leaf and Bold Daisy embossing folder and layering stencil sets from Lisa Horton Crafts. So this Spiral Leaf embossing folder and stencil set, they are 6x6. The Bold Daisy one is 5x7. So you can create a variety of sizes of cards for these. I'm going to just create some A2 cards so they're easy enough to cut down. The pieces that you cut down, you could always put it on the inside of the card to continue the image. I'm not going to use them, but they're a great way to use up those pieces. So I'm going to start with the Spiral Leaf layering stencil, and I'm using my Lisa Horton Crafts Tacky Mat. I like the fact that it holds down that paper really well. These stencils are a little bit bigger than the paper, so it doesn't hold the stencil as well as if there was more stencil on that Tacky Mat. It's okay for the first card, but I do end up using some painter's tape to tape it down for some of the subsequent cards. The cardstock that I'm using is Hammermill Cardstock, and I have a half sheet here, so it's 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches. Once I'm done my stenciling, I'll just pick which part of the image I want to use, and I will cut it down to that size after I've done the stenciling and embossing. I find it's much easier to do this than have, say, a quarter sheet of cardstock and then pick and choose before you're even done your stenciling or before you even start your stenciling. For the first card here, I'm going to use some of the Cloud9 matte blending inks. I'm using Woodland Moss, which is that green color, and I'm also using Loganberry. Now, my inspiration for this card is succulents. I just thought this spiral leaf looked like a succulent, and I love the ones that have the pink tips to them. So that's where the colors for here are chosen from. I wanted to do green in the center and then just have some nice pink tips. So I'm using different blending brushes for each one of these inks. And you could see that after I did the green ink, I took a dry cloth and I cleaned off the excess ink from my stencil so that I didn't pick it up when I was doing the ink blending for the pink color. I don't want to start getting my ink pads muddy, and that's the best way to keep them as clean as possible. And I just have a microfiber cloth that I have in my craft room. Actually, I have two. One is usually damp for wiping down my surfaces and cleaning off my surfaces in between different techniques or different cards. And then I usually have a dry one for either drying my surface or for using it for things like this, where I want to clean my stencil off between colors. Those can get rinsed off and dried or washed, it doesn't matter, regularly. So I always have one that's dry that I can use for dry techniques or things that I want a dry cloth for, and then one that's damp for when I want to clean off different mediums. So with the first stencil done, we can move to the second stencil. And there's 4 different stencils in this set. The first 3 create the spiral leaf, and the 4th one has some extra details to it. So when I'm doing the ink blending for this, I'm concentrating that green ink on the base of each one of these leaves or each one of these petals. They're more leaves. I am getting a little bit of ink on some of the areas that are right beside it if there's an opening right beside it, but that's totally okay. It looks gorgeous once it's done. So you don't have to worry about when you're doing this if you happen to get it on an area that you don't necessarily want it being ruined. Another option would be to take a piece of scrap paper or some painter's tape and block those areas off if you really didn't want the ink there. I didn't bother with this, and to be honest, I bet you once the image is done, it would be hard to pick out those areas where you got ink where you didn't necessarily want. So once again, after the green ink was done on here, I took that dry cloth, cleaned off my stencil, and then went in with the Loganberry. And this can be done with many different color combinations. I've seen so many different versions or different color combinations used with this stencil, and I absolutely love the look of it. I'm using the same 2 colors for the first 3 stencils to create the different leaves because that's the look that I was going for. But if you wanted to, you could use, say, 3 different green tones and do each one of the different layers in a different color. You could also play around with your ink blending brushes, changing your pressure, using light pressure where you wanted light colored ink, heavier pressure where you wanted a heavier coat of ink. I'm also blending in both a circular and both clockwise and semi-clockwise manner to try to get an even coat of ink. Sometimes if you just go one way, whether it's circular or clockwise or counterclockwise, you get the ink starting to build on one area. So by doing it both ways, I can make sure that I get an even coat of ink and I don't have a heavier coat or a heavier application of ink towards one part of the stencil. So now we're on the third layer, and once again I'm repeating the same process, going in with the green color first, being heavier towards the base of each one of the leaves. Then I'm going to clean that stencil off and go in with the Loganberry, which is the pink color. Now another option that you can use with these is once you have them inked, you could go over with like a mist spray, like a shimmer spray, if you wanted to add a little bit of extra texture. I'm going to do that little bit of extra texture with my last stencil, but we'll cover that when we get there. Of course, now that it's cleaned off, we're going in with that Loganberry. Now I'm using the Cloud9 matte blending ink, so they have a matte finish to them. These are also water reactive, so if you wanted to add a little bit of visual texture to these leaves, you could also, after ink blending, you could flick it with water and you can create some spotted leaves as well. You'd have to do that with each and every one of the layers, and personally, I would do it with the layers so that I had a little bit more control over the leaves and we didn't have a splotch of water that goes from one to the other. I think if you did it with the stencil on, you'd have a little bit more control, but that's a way to use the same colors but change it up just slightly. Another option with the stencil on would be to take some Distress Spritz and flick that on, so then you would get some like mica shimmer on those petals, as in mica shimmer splatters or dots or whatever. That would be a great way to add some texture as well. But what I'm going to do here is I am going to use this last stencil, and this one has a bunch of different veiny details. I'm going to use some Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel and cover that. So that is going to add some sparkle to my background here. Now this one, it doesn't add any color. It has some iridescent sparkle to it. So you're going to be able to see the ink color underneath there, but it's going to add some beautiful glittery shimmer. So that's going to add a little bit of extra texture aside from the embossing. So now that that Stickles is on there, I need to let that completely dry before we do our embossing. I did take my damp microfiber cloth and I cleaned off any of that Stickles glitter gel off of my Tacky Mat. You don't want to let it dry on there. It's a lot easier to remove when it's still wet. So anytime I have things like that on my mats, I clean them off while they're wet to avoid it drying on there and then trying to get it off while it's drying. Once that background is completely dry, we can match it up with the images or the image in the stencil, and it's really easy to see through that embossing folder and match it up. And then I put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to emboss. Now I used the stacking for 3D embossing in that machine, but the Lisa Horton Crafts embossing folders are a little bit thinner than the Spellbinders one. So I have a couple sheets of index cardstock that I have folded in half, and I just keep that for any time I want to do some embossing with Lisa Horton Crafts embossing folders. It makes the perfect stacking. You get some nice embossing with it, and you get some decent embossing without that, but it just tightens up that sandwich just a little bit. For my mat, rather than trying to find a perfect cardstock with it, I just took some white cardstock. I cut it to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8, and I just used the green ink, which is the Woodland Moss matte blending ink, and I just rubbed it around the edge of that cardstock so we have a perfectly matched mat. I chose Thanks Extra Large Sentiment from the Best Wishes and Thanks Extra Large die set. I cut those out of white cardstock and then ink blended those same two colors on top of it. Once again, I know that it's going to match perfectly because I'm using the exact same ink. So my image piece here is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. So we have really thin mats around the outside edges of these. So the focus is really on that spiral leaf embossed background. And I always love when you have a nice detailed background just to add a small die cut sentiment, or this one's an extra large die cut sentiment, but just some die cut sentiment to the front to add a little bit of a focal point, but I don't want to cover up too much of that background. It's just too pretty. Once that's layered together, I can glue it to my card. And then I like to put an acrylic block on there just to hold everything in place and make sure that that glue has good contact, especially when we're using an embossed background here. I'm gluing everything with Best Ever Craft glue, or not Best Ever, Barely Art craft glue, and I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for both the background as well as die cutting the sentiment. So with that one done, I want to use this exact same embossing folder and stencil set, but I want to create a background with interference inks. And if you haven't seen me use interference inks before, they're some of my favorite inks to use. They are a special ink that has a different appearance on light cardstock than dark cardstock, or in this case, cardstock that is inked with black and then regular cardstock. You can use them on colored cardstocks, but they have the most impact on black and white. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to use some black distress ink. You could use whatever black ink you like. I like to use dye-based inks simply because it washes off the stencil super easy. And you only need some water to do that. You don't need any special cleaner or anything. It's also really easy to blend onto your cardstock. So I like to use black distress ink, and when I'm using those interference pads, I will take them with the stencil and I will use the areas that I want to be shaded or darker, and I will put some black ink there. Then I will take that dry microfiber cloth, wipe off any excess ink, and then use my interference pad. Now, I do this, or if the first couple layers here, without taping my stencil down, but it does get to a point where I do tape my stencil down because I find, especially with doing the two different inks for this, it's a lot easier. Once I go to clean off my ink pad, or once I go to clean off my stencil here, I realize that it's just moving too much, and it's just easier to take some painter's tape and tape everything down rather than having to hold that stencil in place and worry about it. Now that I have cleaned off the black distress ink, I can go in with my interference ink. This one here is Summer Garden. So this one is green on white cardstock, but when it's on black cardstock, or in this case, black ink, it's going to have more of a blue look to it. It has some blue mica shimmer to it. You still see that shimmer when you tilt it in the light, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I love working with these ink pads. They're so versatile, and that shimmer is absolutely stunning. So here's the point where I grab some painter's tape and I just tape that stencil down. It's not going to hurt the tacky mat in any way, but it's going to make your life a little bit easier because you're not going to have to worry about holding that stencil in place. It's going to stay in place. So I'm going to repeat that same process. Now for this particular stencil, I used that detail one first because I want the black detail, that black ink detail, to be underneath my interference ink. Another option here would be to do similar to what I did in the first card and not do that detail in black first, but do it last, but not in black. Just do it with that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel. But I wanted to see that detail under the interference inks. I always love exactly what they do and how they change the ink colors, and I thought that would be a nice detail on this particular background. So once again, did my black soot distress ink here, use my microfiber cloth to clean it off, and then went in with the interference pads. And for this one, as well as the first one, I always like to clean it off between the different colors inks because I don't want that ink to start pulling off the other ink and contaminate my pads. And by doing it this way, it keeps them as clean as possible. Now, the other thing I do with my interference inks is I have each pad has its own brush. So I have a label maker where I put the labels on the ink or onto the ink blending brushes. So each one of those has its own brush. So I don't have to clean them out and make sure that they're dry for my next project. I just have one for each of the ink pads that I have. And I also have one of the detailed ink blending brushes for smaller areas as well, and just keep them in a drawer with those ink pads. So here's the last stencil, and I'm going to do once again exactly the same steps, going in with that black soot distress ink blending just towards the base of that petal, and then lightly feathering it out, and then once again cleaning off my stencil and off that ink and going in with that interference pad. Now I chose the Summer Garden interference pad because the green color is very similar to leaves and greenery, and I love the blue color that shows up on the black. You could use any color you want to get this background, and I think they would look gorgeous in different colors. I can't wait to play with it with a variety of different colors as well, because I think it would look absolutely gorgeous. Another thing that I think would look absolutely gorgeous is the same technique, but with each layer being a different interference pad color. So at some point I'm going to get a chance to play with that because I think it's going to be absolutely beautiful, but I really love the final result of this. You get a beautiful embossed background with that interference shimmer detail that just shines beautifully in the light, and the embossed detail from that embossing folder. Now, when you tilt it in the light, you really get to see that interference, and I absolutely love the look of it. So I know that I'm going to do more die cutting of sentiments here. So I'm taking that pad and I'm using some black cardstock as well as white cardstock, just smooshing some ink on there. You could also use the ink blending brush and just ink blend it on there. It's just easier sometimes to just go right in with that pad. And I'm also going to use some black cardstock with that ink on top of it for my mat. So I cut that down, and I cut it down to the same sizes as my last one. So it's 5 1/8 inch by, 5 3/8 inch by 4 1/8 inch. Then I'm taking my background here, matching it up with the stencil. And like I said before, it's really easy to match up because this particular pattern has those white layers or white lines between it. You can really see where the detail goes, and you can easily match it up in your embossing folder. Once it's matched up, we can put it through the embossing or the embossing machine, here my Platinum 6, and emboss that detail in there, and you get a gorgeous card background there. Now, like I said before, this is a 6x6 embossing folder and stencil set. So you could make cards as big as 6x6. You could even do 5x7 cards and cut this down to 4x6 and then have a larger mat around it, or even a small mat around it, but have more white space on your card. So you really have a lot of different options when it comes to card sizes. My favorite size though is the 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch. So that's what I typically do most. My layout for this is going to be the same as my first card. I just like the nice simple layout with the simple sentiments on the front. For this particular one though, I use the wedding day extra large sentiments. So I use the congrats die cut, which is another perfect complement to this. I just wanted to change it up from the thanks, but I didn't want to have a sentiment that was so large that I would cover too much of this. I wanted to keep it to one separate word or one single word. So I'm going to glue the sentiment onto the shadow part. And because this was inked with the same ink as the background is, it's going to match absolutely perfectly. You could even take one of these layers and just use white cardstock to blend in with the white lines on the design as well as the white card base. But I really love the look of the ink blending matching the ink color on the sentiment. So there we have our first two cards. Very similar in design, but different because of the colors used. Next, for our third card, I'm going to use the Bold Daisy layering stencil and embossing folder. I once again have a half sheet of Hammermill cardstock. So this is the sheet that I'm using is 5 1/2 inches by 8 1/2 inches. And then I'm going to tape down the stencil because my stencil is made for a 5x7. It's just a little bit smaller than the paper. So you definitely need to tape it down for this unless you're using a smaller piece of cardstock. I'm going to use some Cloud9 matte blending inks again. For the center of my flowers, I'm using Anthracite. It's a nice dark black, but it has a little bit of a green tone to it. I'm using Sugar Candy for my flowers, and I'm making sure that that ink is a little bit darker towards the center of my flowers and a little bit lighter towards the outside. I took that dry cloth to clean off that Anthracite ink again because I didn't want to chance when I was doing these pink flowers smearing some of that ink into them. And by cleaning that off the stencil, it makes it easiest to get a nice clean blend. When I'm using these stencils on my cardstock, I tend to line it up with the left side of the cardstock and the top of the cardstock for the first layer. And then after that first layer, most of the time you can just line it up with the patterns that you've already created with the stencil. So for my second layer here, once again, I'm going in with Anthracite for the centers of the flowers. This time I'm going to go in with some Spiced Plum for the petals for the next flowers, and this is a purple color. I wanted some nice bright summery colors for this. which is why I chose the pink, the purple, and the blue. I personally am not really a daisy fan just because of the yellow center, and yellow tends to be one of my least favorite colors, but I absolutely love Gerber daisies with all of their bright colors. And I know they don't come in blue, but this is a fantasy. We're creating a card base here. We can create whatever colors we want to, and I love that about card making. So once again, with this spiced plum, I tried to make the color darker or heavier in the center of the flower than the outside of the petals. And then I can take that stencil off and go in with my third stencil here. So once I have that lined up, I can put my painter's tape down and tape that into place. This one here, I'm going to go in with the Surfs Up, which is the bright blue color. And I love the look of the pink, purple, and blue together. I love the final background of this. I think it looks so fun. And it almost looks a little bit retro with the colors, like a little bit, I don't know. They're just nice and bright. So once again, using a different ink blending brush, but making sure that I am heavier with the ink towards the center. This is the easiest way to use ink blending on these stencils rather than doing several colors. If you do a heavier coat in the center, lighter coat around the outside, it almost looks like you're using multiple colors, or it gives it visual dimension anyways. With that third stencil done, we can go in with the layer that has all the detail. And once again, I'm going to do the same as I did for the first card. I'm going to layer it together or line it all up, tape it in place, and I'm going to use that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel with a palette knife. I just love the sparkle it gives, and I love the fact that it doesn't change colors or cover up colors. You can see the color right through it. It just adds that sparkle detail, which is absolutely beautiful. And I think it suits the flowers really, really well. So once I have this on here, I can take it off. Make sure to clean off any Stickles glitter gel that came or got on my tacky mat. I also clean off my stencil and my palette knife right away. We don't want to let any of that dry on anything. It's much easier to clean off while it's dry or while it's wet. And if you happen to let it dry on your stencil, there's a good chance you're going to ruin your stencil while trying to get it off. So once again, easiest to clean it off while it's wet, and you don't need any special cleaner. I just run it under a tap and then use my fingers to rub that glitter gel off of there. After the background has completely dried, I can line it up with my embossing folder, run it through my Platinum 6 machine, and emboss that detail in there. And then I can cut it down to size. And once again, I'm cutting it to create a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card. So I cut this down to 4 inches, 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And my mat is going to be 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. I seem to love the 1/8 inch mats lately. So that's what I've been doing a lot on most of my cards. In order to get a perfectly coordinated mat on here, I'm just using that Surfs Up pad and just rubbing it around the outside of my cardstock. Now this particular color probably would have been easy enough to find some cardstock to create a mat in my scrap bin, but it was just as easy to grab a piece of white cardstock and use the ink pad to ink around the edges of my mat. That way I know it's going to work perfectly. And it's a really easy way to stretch your supplies. Rather than having a lot of colored cardstock, it's very easy to just use the ink pad that you used with your ink blending and then put it around the outside of the mat to coordinate those two together. For my sentiment, I use that anthracite on the shadow, and then I use that same Surfs Up, the blue ink pad on the sentiment part. I did the thanks one again. I really like this one, and I think the thanks sentiment is one that I use a lot of for cards, probably more than congrats, so I figured that would be a good one to choose. Now, rather than doing another vertical card, I figured I would make the sentiment or make this card a horizontal card. This particular pattern has no right or wrong way to it, so it makes it really easy to do a vertical or horizontal card with this. So the fourth card, once again, I'm going to pull in some Cloud9 interference pads. So I'm going to do the same technique with that. I thought this would be fun to create some daisies with a fall color theme. So just the same as my second card with the interference inks, I'm going in with the Black Soot Distress ink. I did the detailed ink blending brush for the centers of the flowers. I didn't want a chance getting some of that black ink on the outside of the flower petals. Then I'm using a little bit larger ink blending brush for my flower petals, making sure it is heavier in the center and then going out a little bit lighter, using that dry cloth to completely clean off my stencil before going in with the interference pads. For the centers of my flowers, I'm using Royal Truffle. So this one has a brown look to it, but on top of black, it has a blue look to it. So I thought it would be fun for the flower center here. And then for my first set of daisies, I'm using Warm Chestnut. This one has a bit of a burgundy color to it and then blue on the black. So it's going to coordinate beautifully with those flower centers. And this fall palette just looks absolutely stunning together. I love the final look of these daisies with these colors. I think they're different, they're unique, and they're unexpected. So when I do my ink blending with the matte blending inks, I make sure to be heavier towards the center of the flower and lighter towards the outside. When it comes to the interference pads though, I just do an even coat, and that's because I've already gone in and done that black ink with the distress pad. So I kind of already have my shadow area for that. So for the rest of it, I keep it an even ink coat. Now, I'm also taping these down just like I did the first one. You kind of need to with this one because my paper is a little bit bigger than the stencil. And because of that, I don't have to worry about holding that stencil down and making sure it doesn't shift. Because it's taped, it's not going to shift on me. So now I'm using the detailed stencil here. This one adds those lines to it. I forgot to do it before that first one. I really should have. However, it's going to be totally fine. You still see for those center flowers where I already did them, you see the black ink, but it's really subtle. I think you have to look at it really closely to notice that it's black ink and not the interference over top of it. If it was to the point where it bothered me that I saw that black ink over top of the interference, what I would just do is take that first stencil that I used and go back over it and just do another layer with that interference ink colors. But you don't really notice. There's enough going on with this background that I don't think it makes a huge difference. But if it bothers you, if you're doing this and you want that interference color over top of it, just line up that first stencil again. Makes it really, really easy. So once again, for each layer, I'm going to repeat that same process. I'm using a detailed ink blending brush for the centers of the flowers. You probably could use the other ink blending brush. You just have to be a little bit more careful. Like I said before, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to get any of that black ink on the outside of my petals, which is why I'm using that detailed one. Going back in with that Royal Truffle, and I just realized that I said the wrong thing when I was talking about this with the first layer. This one has a blue look on white and a brown look on black. I always have to stop and say this slowly to make sure that I'm saying it correctly. So when I go in with that color, it's going to look brown on there, not blue. The next color that I'm using here is Golden Sun. So Golden Sun has a corally color on light cardstock, but on black cardstock or black ink, it has more of a gold color. So once again, it ties in with the fall colors and it looks gorgeous with that Warm Chestnut ink pad. The third color I'm going to use is Pumpkin Spice, and all three of these together, to me, are just a beautiful combination. Even though gold and like oranges are not my favorite, they're a little bit better to me than yellow is. But I love these fall colors together, and I just love the fall color palette, and just those warm colors I think are absolutely gorgeous. So now we are ready to do the fourth and last stencil. And I think my tape will be done once I'm done here. So going back in with that distress ink to do the ink blending for the centers of the flowers, cleaning off that background, and then using the Pumpkin Spice. So the Pumpkin Spice is going to show up orange on the white cardstock, and then on the black cardstock or black ink here, it's going to show up purple. So these colors blend together beautifully. They look together gorgeous on their own or with each other. So once this is done, I can take it out and I can use my embossing folder on it. Now these interference inks, they also wash off very easily off your stencils. No cleaners needed. I just run them under the tap and use my fingers to just kind of rub the ink off. Most of the ink just comes right off under the water. You don't even really need to rub it. So you don't have to worry about using them on your stencils and having to use a special cleaner. You don't need a special cleaner at all. For my sentiments, I'm going to use that Royal Truffle, and then I'm also going to use the Golden Sun together, and it's going to look beautiful on that background. I'm cutting a piece of black cardstock for my mat around it, and I once again cut this to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8, and I'm using that Golden Sun on there. When I do this, I try to keep as much as possible to the outside of the cardstock. I get a little bit, or sometimes a lot, on my glass surface here. If I was working on another project, I would take some mixed media cardstock or something and lift that color up. For when I'm videotaping though, I just use a damp cloth and just wipe it up to clean it up, rather than creating a second project while I'm working on a first one. So I matched up my background here with that embossing folder and embossed it, and now I can cut this down. This is going to be cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and because we have that extra on this background here, you can see I'm cutting a decent amount off. Like I said at the beginning of the video, you could save those pieces and then say add a strip on the inside of your card if you wanted to use them up right away. You could save them for future projects and just use them as a focal point on the side of a card and keep a card very, very simple. I also think it would be gorgeous to emboss or use this embossing folder on white cardstock, match up the pattern for those pieces or for at least one of those pieces, and just have that on the side of a card with a white embossed background and just part of it colored. I think it would look absolutely beautiful. So a few different ways that you can use that. Once I have my mats and my background glued to my card, I can glue my sentiment down. And I like to put an acrylic block on top of my piece here when I am gluing them, just to keep everything nice and flat. I think here though, I used the embossing folder rather than my acrylic block. Probably someone was talking to me, or I was thinking about something else and not really paying attention to what I was doing, which sometimes happens. Now I can glue down my sentiment to my card. And once again, this background is so very simple. So you can glue down, simple but busy, but you can glue down your sentiment wherever you want on that card, and you're not going to ruin a design or cover up too much. So you have a lot of creative freedom when it comes to that. And I love the fact that with that background, you can also do it horizontally or vertically, giving you a little bit more options. And really both of those backgrounds could be horizontal or vertical. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you were inspired by a few different ways you can use that spiral leaf and the bold daisy background and stencils. I absolutely loved creating with them, and I can't wait to create with them again. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.